In 1996, the small Brazilian town of Varginha witnessed something that shouldn't exist. This is the story of a silver craft falling from the heavens, a mysterious sickness, and the red-eyed creature that changed witnesses' lives forever. Today, we dive deep into the chilling details of the Varginha incident, a case the authorities tried to bury, but the world cannot forget. If you're fascinated by true mysteries and the unexplained, hit the subscribe button and join us as we uncover the truth. The heat that day was not natural. It pressed down on the farm like a heavy wool blanket soaked in hot water. I remember wiping the sweat from my eyes, the salt stinging as I looked out over the pastures. Aurelina was there, standing near the fence line, her silhouette cut sharp against the bright sky. We were used to the sun. We were used to the hard work of the land. But we were not ready for the sky to betray us. The birds usually sang in the afternoon, a constant chatter from the trees. But that day, the air went dead. It was a sudden silence, as if a hand had been clamped over the mouth of the world. I looked to the cattle. Usually they are slow, simple beasts, always chewing, always moving their heavy heads. But they had frozen. It was a sight that made the hair on my arms stand up. 50 head of cattle, standing like statues carved from stone. They did not graze. They did not flick their tails to shoo away the flies. They all faced the same direction, staring toward the north, their eyes wide and rolling with a terror they could not voice. I called out to them, but my voice sounded thin and weak in the open air. Nothing moved. The stillness was so absolute, it felt like a ringing in the ears. Then I felt it before I saw it. It was not a sound. There was no roar of an engine, no thunder of burning fuel like the airplanes that sometimes pass high above. It was a vibration. It started in the soles of my boots and traveled up through my bones. My teeth began to ache and rattle in my jaw. It was a deep, sickly thrumming, like the earth itself was shivering from a fever. Aurelina pointed a shaking hand toward the horizon. I followed her gaze and saw the shadow that should not have been there. It drifted over the fields, stealing the sunlight. Above us, a shape moved against the blue. It was long and rounded at the ends, the color of dull silver, like an old coin worn smooth by many hands. It had no wings. It had no rivets or seams that a man could make. It floated with a terrible grace, sliding through the air without disturbing the wind. It looked heavy, impossibly heavy, yet it hung there as if the laws of nature did not apply to it. It did not look like a machine. It looked like a silver wound in the sky. As we watched, the great vessel began to dip. It did not fall straight down like a stone dropped from a hand. It wobbled. It listed to the side like a bird that had been struck by a hunter's arrow, struggling to keep the air beneath it. It descended slowly, agonizingly slowly, toward the jagged line of hills in the distance. There was no fire yet, only that sickly, silent motion. It slipped behind the ridge, and for a heartbeat, I prayed it had just flown away. But then the smoke rose. It billowed up from behind the hills, black and oily. It stained the perfect blue of the afternoon, rising in a thick, dark column that did not disperse in the wind. It looked like the funeral pyre of a king. The vibration in my teeth stopped, replaced by a heaviness in the air that made it hard to breathe. It felt as though a storm was about to break, but the sky was clear. The air was charged with an invisible energy, prickling against the skin, making me feel nauseous and dizzy. I looked for the dogs, the brave hounds that usually barked at every passing stranger. I found them later, shoved as far back as they could go beneath the wooden floorboards of the porch. They were trembling, pressing their bellies into the cool dirt, whining with a sound I had never heard a dog make. They knew. The animals knew before we did that something had fallen from the stars, something that brought a sickness with it. The farm was quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath before a scream. The morning did not stay quiet. The stillness that had fallen over the farm was broken not by the birds returning, but by a roar that shook the coffee in my cup. It was a mechanical grinding, a sound of heavy iron eating up the road. I stepped off the porch, my boots sinking into the dry soil, and watched the horizon again. But this time, the threat was not in the sky. It was on the earth. Great green trucks came tearing down the unpaved roads. There were so many of them, moving in a long, snake-like line that seemed to have no end. They did not slow down for the potholes or the ruts. They smashed through them, their heavy tires kicking up clouds of the red dust that covers our land. The dust hung in the air like a bloody mist, coating the trees and the fences, choking the breath out of the morning. These were not the vehicles of farmers or merchants. They were machines of war, covered in thick canvas, hiding whatever or whoever sat inside. I went to the gate, but I did not go out. I saw men jumping down from the backs of the trucks before the wheels had even stopped turning. They wore uniforms the color of the forest, but their faces were pale and hard like stone. They did not look at us. They did not ask for directions or offer greetings. They moved with a terrifying purpose, shouting orders that were short and sharp, like the crack of a whip. They set up barriers on the roads, blocking the path to the hills where the smoke still drifted. I saw the local police there, men I had known all my life, men who drank in the tavern and waved at children. They looked small now. They looked confused. I watched as a young officer tried to speak to one of the soldiers, pointing toward the town. The soldier did not even look in the eye. He just raised a hand, heavy with authority, and pushed the local man aside. It was clear then. The law of our town no longer mattered. A higher power had arrived, a power that did not care about our fences or our rights. The neighbors were peeking through their wooden shutters, eyes wide in the gloom of their homes. We all felt it. It was the feeling of a war coming home, to a place that had never known battle. But there was no enemy army to be seen, only the empty sky and the jagged line of the hills. The soldiers stood with their backs to us, their rifles held across their chests, facing the wild brush. They were waiting for something, and they were afraid. I could see it in the way their knuckles turned white on the black metal of their guns. The canopy of trees above the road, usually alive with the sound of insects and monkeys, had fallen unnaturally quiet again. The noise of the engines died down, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. But the animals did not speak. The world felt held in suspense. Then the wind shifted. It blew down from the ridge, carrying a smell that made my stomach turn. It was not the smell of a forest fire. It smelled of burning rubber and hot copper, the scent of lightning when it strikes a dry field. It was the smell of a storm, but the sun was beating down on us, hot and unrelenting. We were trapped between the men with guns and the thing that burned in the woods. The soldiers with the rifles stayed on the high ground, standing like fence posts along the ridge. It was the men in the red trucks, the fire killers, who were sent down into the dark belly of the land. I watched from a distance, hidden by the trunk of a great tree, as they descended into the ravine. That place is an ugly cut in the earth, full of sharp rocks and thorns that tear at your clothes. It is a place where the sun struggles to reach the ground, The men moved slowly, slipping on the loose stones, their boots scraping loudly in the quiet air. They did not carry hoses or axes. They did not look like men going to fight a fire. They carried heavy nets, woven thick and strong, and they wore gloves of stiff leather that went up to their elbows. It made no sense to my eyes. If there was a fire from the smoke we saw, you need water. If there was a man hurt in the crash, you need a stretcher. But they moved like hunters. They spread out in a line, beating the brush with sticks, their eyes darting side to side. They were looking for something that could run. Then the sound came up from the bottom of the hollow. It was not a scream. A man screams with his throat. An animal roars with its chest. This sound was a buzzing, a wet, rattling vibration, like a hive of angry bees kicked open by a boot. It was a noise of pure panic, but it was small, like a child crying into a pillow. The men froze. I saw one of them point a shaking finger toward a clump of tall, dry weeds that grew near the muddy creek bed. The movement in the leaves was wrong. When a jaguar moves, it flows like water. When a deer runs, it bounds with grace. This thing moved with a jerky, broken rhythm. It thrashed against the foliage. It looked like a puppet with cut strings, stumbling and twitching. It was terrified. I could feel its fear from where I stood. It was not charging at them to kill. It was trying to dig, trying to hide, trying to melt into the dirt to escape the men standing over it. The capture was clumsy. There was no grace in it. The men fell upon the brush with their nets, shouting over each other, their voices high and cracked. The thing did not fight like a wild beast. It did not bite or claw. It just flailed, trapped in the mesh. I saw flashes of brown skin, wet and oily, but no fur. I saw limbs that bent in ways that made my own joints ache to watch. It was a mess of tangles and shouting, a chaotic scramble in the mud. They brought forward a wooden box, a rough crate usually used for carrying tools. They shoved the bundled net inside, pushing down the lid with force. The buzzing sound was muffled now, a low drone coming from inside the wood. When the men lifted the box, they did not look proud. They did not look like heroes who had saved the town. They looked pale. One of them pulled off his helmet and wiped his face, and even from far away, I could see his hand was trembling. They looked at the box with a mixture of disgust and pity, like they were carrying a curse that would stain their souls. They climbed back up the hill, struggling with the weight, leaving the hollow silent once more. The day was dying, surrendering to the evening, when the three sisters began their walk home. They cut across the empty land, the patch of wild grass that sits between the houses like a forgotten thought. The sky above them had turned the color of a deep bruise, purple and gray, promising rain that had not yet fallen. They were young, full of the kind of life that ignores the shadows. They walked close together, their voices light and chiming, talking of the small things that fill a young woman's day, the price of bread, the look a boy gave them, the work that waited for them tomorrow. They did not know that the world had already changed. As they walked, the wind died. It did not fade away slowly. It stopped as if a door had been slammed shut on the world. The tall grass, which had been swaying and whispering against their legs, stood perfectly still. The silence that followed was heavy. It was a vacuum, sucking the noise out of the air. The sisters' voices sounded too loud, too sharp in the sudden quiet. They stopped talking, looking around, sensing the shift. The birds were gone. The insects had ceased their songs. It felt as if they were the only living things left on the earth. Their path took them alongside the old wall. It was a crumbling thing, made of concrete blocks that were turning to dust, covered in the angry painted marks of the town's youth. Vines and weeds clawed at the base of it, trying to pull it down into the soil. It was an ugly place, a place where people threw their trash and looked the other way. But as they approached the corner where the wall met the dense brush, the air changed again. It was not a sound this time, but a smell. It hit them like a physical blow, a wall of stink that made their eyes water. It was a sharp, biting scent, like the strong spirits used to clean floors, mixed with the rot of old eggs and burning rocks. It was the smell of sulfur and ammonia, thick and suffocating. It tasted like metal on the tongue. The youngest sister covered her nose and mouth with her hand, gagging. The atmosphere grew thick, pressing against their chests. Walking forward felt like wading through deep, muddy water. The air itself seemed to resist them, warning them to turn back. But they took those final few steps toward the corner, drawn by the terrible gravity of the unknown. I cannot say how long they stood there. In moments like that, the clock in your head stops ticking. The world narrows down to a single point. There, crouched in the mud and the weeds against the crumbling wall, was the source of the smell. It was not a dog. It was not a monkey from the jungle. It was a nightmare that had been given breath and weight. It huddled low to the ground, pulling its knees up to its chest like a frightened child. But it was no child of ours. Its skin was the color of dark, wet earth, a deep, muddy brown. It looked slick, covered in a thick, oily grease that caught the dim light of the evening. It did not sweat like a man. It glistened as if it had just been pulled from a womb of slime. The skin looked loose in places, yet tight over the bone in others, sickly and wrong. Then it turned its head. The sisters saw its face, and the scream died in their throats before it could be born. The eyes were massive. They were two great, red orbs that bulged from the skull, tilting upward at the corners. There was no white in them, no pupil to focus on. They were just pools of solid, glowing blood. They were wet and shaking, darting back and forth with a panic that was easy to understand. Above those terrible eyes, the head was swollen and hairless. 3 distinct ridges of bone rose up over the top of the skull, running back like the veins on a leaf. It was a head made for a place where the sun does not shine. The creature did not bear teeth. It did not growl. It raised a hand with long, thin fingers that looked like twigs, and held its head. It rocked back and forth, a motion of pure misery. It was shivering violently, the oil on its skin rippling. It looked weak. It looked like it was in pain, suffering from the air we breathe, crushed by the gravity of our earth. But to the girls, standing there in their simple dresses, it was not a victim. It was the devil himself. It was a demon rising up from the hells to test their faith. The air around them felt electric, buzzing against their skin. Time seemed to skip a beat, the image of the red eyes burning into their minds like a brand on cattle. They could not look away. The fear was not just in their minds, it was in their blood, a cold poison that locked their muscles. They were looking at something that broke the rules of God's creation. The thing made a sound then, a soft, pitiful whimper that sounded like wind blowing through a crack in a tomb. It was the sound of something that knew it was dying. The spell broke with a scream. I do not know which of the sisters found her voice first, but it shattered the heavy silence like a hammer striking glass. Their legs, which had been frozen by the sight of those red eyes, suddenly found the desperate strength of the hunted. They turned and ran. They did not look back. They did not care for the stones that cut their feet or the branches that whipped their faces. They ran with the blind, animal panic of those who have seen the face of the abyss. They burst into their home, their lungs burning, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. They were weeping, tears streaming down faces pale with shock. They grabbed their mother, their hands clutching at her apron, their words tumbling over one another in a frantic mess. They spoke of the devil. They screamed that Lucifer himself was crouching in the weeds by the old wall. They were hysterical, their eyes wide and seeing only the memory of that oily skin and the ridges on the skull. The mother tried to hush them, to calm the storm in her kitchen. But then she stopped. She pulled back and sniffed the air. The smell had followed them. It clung to their dresses and their hair, a stubborn, invisible stain. It was the scent of brimstone, of deep places in the earth where fires burn without wood. It was the smell of sickness and old rot. It filled the small house, choking the air, making the mother cross herself and whisper a prayer to the Virgin. It was not the smell of the devil, perhaps, but it was certainly the smell of something unclean. Drawn by the screaming and the strange odors, the neighbors gathered. Men with rough hands and curious eyes, women wiping flour from their fingers. They heard the story, disjointed and wild, and felt the fear radiating from the girls. A brave few, the ones who always ran toward the fire, decided to go back. They took heavy sticks and flashlights, for the light was failing fast now. They walked to the vacant lot, the grass crunching under their boots. But the thing was gone. The wall stood silent and empty. The weeds were flattened, matted down into a nest where something heavy had rested. The men shone their lights on the ground, searching for answers. There, pressed deep into the soft, red clay, were the marks. They were not the prints of a man's boot, nor the paw of a jaguar. They were V-shaped, simple and strange, pointing toward the road. A round depression sat at the base of the V, as if the creature walked on stilts or hooves. One of the neighbors had brought his dog, fierce mongrel used to hunting rats. The dog approached the matted grass, its hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in its throat. It sniffed the spot where the being had crouched. Immediately, the animal convulsed. It backed away, whining, and retched violently, vomiting onto the dirt. It would not go near the wall again. It tucked its tail and ran for home, leaving the men standing in the dark, breathing in the fading scent of sulfur, knowing that something walked their streets that did not belong to this world. The sun had gone, dragging the last of the light behind the hills, but the darkness brought no peace. The town should have been settling into its dinner, the smell of cooking fires and the sound of televisions filling the streets. Instead, the engines returned. The military trucks came back under the cover of the dusk, their headlights cutting through the gloom like yellow eyes. They did not move with the arrogance of the morning. They moved with urgency, like men who are late for a funeral. I watched from the shadow of my doorway. The soldiers spilled out of the trucks again, but this time, their movements were jerky and nervous. They swept the area near the road, their flashlights dancing frantically over the bushes and the ditches. Their weapons were drawn, the black metal gleaming in the artificial light. But I saw the barrels shaking. These were not men hunting an enemy, they understood. They were boys, terrified of the dark, terrified of what might be hiding in it. They found it near the edge of the asphalt, where the town meets the wild grass. It was another one, not the one the girls had seen by the wall, but a brother to it, or sister. It was small, huddled against the cold earth. It was trying to move, but it was weak. It limped, dragging a leg that looked twisted and useless. It did not run. It did not try to attack the men who surrounded it. It simply stopped, blinded by the beams of the flashlights, raising a hand to shield those great, sensitive eyes. I waited for the crack of rifles. I waited to see the flash of fire that ends a life. But the order never came. The soldiers lowered their guns, though they did not holster them. Instead, two of them rushed forward with a large sheet of heavy canvas, the kind used to cover cargo in the rain. They threw it over the creature, burying that brown, oily skin and those ridges beneath the rough fabric. The thing struggled, but only a little. It was the struggle of something that has no strength left to give. Then came the sound. It was not a roar, and it was not the buzzing noise from the ravine. Muffled by the heavy canvas, the being made a sound that I will hear until the day I die. It wept. It was a high, trembling cry, a sound of such pure, naked sorrow that it made my own heart ache. It sounded like a child who has been abandoned in a dark forest. It was a sound of intelligence, of a soul that knows it is lost. It was not the noise of a beast. Beasts fight or they die silent. This thing grieved. The soldiers did not pause to comfort it. They did not treat it like a prisoner of war or patient. They treated it like garbage. They scooped up the bundle, the canvas lumpy and shifting, and ran to the nearest truck. They threw it into the back, onto the metal floor, with a heavy thud. The weeping stopped, or perhaps the engine noise drowned it out. The tailgate was slammed shut, the iron lock engaging with a final click. The convoy did not wait to regroup. They gunned the engines, the tires screaming against the pavement as they peeled away. They drove without care, ignoring the stop signs, swerving into the other lane, forcing a civilian car off the road. They fled the scene as if the devil himself was chasing them, taking their sad, broken prize into the night. The convoy did not slow down until it reached the gates of the regional hospital. I was there, working the late shift, pushing the mop across the cold tiles that always smelled of bleach and sickness. The trucks swarmed the entrance like a pack of wolves surrounding a wounded deer. They blocked the ambulance bays. They blocked the doors where the families came to visit. It was an invasion, plain and simple. They did not park between the lines. They parked wherever the heavy tires stopped rolling, creating a wall of steel and canvas that cut us off from the world outside. The order came down swiftly. It was not a request. A captain with a face like a clenched fist marched into the lobby, his boots leaving muddy prints on my clean floor. He demanded the entire wing be cleared. It did not matter that there were sick people in the beds. It did not matter that grandmothers were sleeping or that men were recovering from surgery. The soldiers moved them. I watched as they wheeled gurneys out into the hallways, pushing confused patients into other wards, crowding them like cattle in a pen. There was no explanation given, only the barrel of a gun pointed at anyone who asked why. Doctors were summoned from their rest. These were proud men, men of science who walked with their heads high. But that night, they looked small. I saw men in dark suits, men who were not soldiers, but something worse. Take the doctors aside. They spoke to them in low voices. I could not hear the words, but I saw the color drain from the doctors' faces. I saw the way they nodded, quick and terrified. They were being told to forget what they were about to see. Or perhaps they were being told that their lives depended on their silence. The Hippocratic oath, the promise to do no harm, was suspended that night. Then they brought it in. The corridors were cleared, but I was hiding in a supply closet. The door cracked just enough to see. They wheeled a stretcher down the hall, surrounded by armed guards, who looked at every shadow as if it held a knife. The thing on the stretcher was covered, but the smell announced its arrival before the wheels squeaked past. It was that same smell the town was whispering about: sulfur and ammonia. It fought against the sharp scent of the hospital alcohol, overpowering it. It smelled like a swamp that had caught fire. It made my eyes water and my throat close up. As the stretcher passed the nurse's station, the world went wrong. The lights overhead, long tubes of white glass, began to flicker. They buzzed angrily, flashing on and off in a strobe that made the soldiers' movements look jerky and unnatural. The heart monitors in the nearby rooms went wild, beeping out rhythms that made no sense. It was as if the creature carried a storm inside its body, an invisible energy that the machines could not handle. The air felt heavy and static, making the hair on my arms stand up. They pushed the stretcher into the isolation ward, and the double doors swung shut. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the screaming started. It did not sound like the weeping I had heard about near the truck. This was a sound of agony. It was not human, and it was not animal. It sounded like metal tearing, like a voice trying to speak through a throat not built for sound. It was a high, garbled shriek that vibrated in the teeth. The armed guards stood outside those doors like statues, their faces pale, their hands white on their rifles. They did not look like they were guarding a prisoner. They looked like they were guarding the gate to hell, praying that whatever was on the other side would not get out. Marco was just a boy. He wore the uniform, yes, and he stood tall in his boots. But under that helmet, he was 23 years old. He had a girl waiting for him in the city, and a mother who lit candles for his safety every Sunday. He was not built for the things that happened in that hallway. I knew him. He was the kind of soldier who would share his water or help you lift a heavy crate without being asked. He was there when they moved the second creature, the one that had been weeping in the back of the truck. The transfer from the truck to the gurney was a mess. The doctors were shouting orders that made no sense. The lights were flashing like a thunderstorm, trapped indoors, and the wheels of the stretcher caught on the lip of the entrance. The sudden jolt threw the creature to the side. The canvas sheet slipped. Without thinking, because that is how the army trains you, to act before you think, Marco reached out. He dropped his weapon to its sling and lunged forward to keep the being from hitting the hard floor. He was not wearing the heavy yellow gloves the doctors wore. He was not wearing a suit. He reached out with his bare hand, the same hand he used to hold his coffee, and he touched the unknown. He told me later, in the short time before the fever burned his mind away, what it felt like. He said it was not like touching an animal. An animal has warmth. It has a pulse you can feel thumping against your palm. This skin was cold, but not the cold of the dead. It was the cold of a stone found deep in a wet cave. It was slick, covered in that thick, brown grease that smelled of ammonia. Marco said his fingers sank into it slightly, as if the flesh was soft and viscous, like dough that had been left out too long. The residue stuck to him instantly, coating his skin in a dark film that felt heavy, as if it were made of lead the moment he made contact. Marco gasped. I saw his knees buckle. He looked as if someone had punched him in the stomach. He said it felt like a plug had been pulled from the bottom of his soul. His strength, his youth, the very heat of his blood seemed to rush out of him and into the creature. It was a drainage, a sudden, violent siphoning of his vitality. He staggered back, his face turning the color of old ash, his hand still held out in front of him, shaking uncontrollably. But the worst part, he whispered to me, was not the sickness in his body. It was the eyes. As Marco steadied the creature, it turned its swollen head. those massive red orbs locked onto his own. There was no pupil, no white, just that deep, swimming crimson. Marco said that in that second, the noise of the hospital, the shouting doctors, the buzzing lights, the boots on the tile, all of it vanished. There was only him and the being. He did not feel hatred coming from it. He did not feel the malice of a demon or the hunger of a predator. He felt sadness. It washed over him like a tidal wave, a crushing, heavy sorrow that was too big for a human heart to hold. It was the sadness of a thing that is lost, far from the stars, dying in a place where everything is poison. It was a silent plea for help that he could not answer. Marco stood there, paralyzed by a grief that was not his own, tears filling his eyes before he even knew he was crying. The other soldiers pushed him aside then, shoving the gurney through the double doors and breaking the connection. But the damage was done. Marco looked at his hand, coated in the strange oil. And then he looked at me. He looked like an old man. He looked like he had seen the end of the world. It did not take weeks for the shadow to claim him. It took only days. Marco, the boy who had been strong enough to lift the back end of a jeep, began to fade before the sun had even set on the day of the encounter. At first, he thought it was just the exhaustion of the fear, a heaviness in the limbs that comes after the adrenaline leaves the blood. But then the heat came. It was not a fever of the flu. It was a fire that burned from the inside out, a heat so intense that his skin felt dry and papery to the touch, like a leaf left too long in the sun. He was taken to the infirmary, but the beds there were not meant for curses. A boil appeared under his arm, right where the limb joins the chest. It was an ugly thing, swelling fast, turning the color of deep purple and then a dead, hollow black. The doctors, the ones who had not been sworn to silence by the men in suits, tried to lance it. They expected pus, the yellow fluid of a normal infection. But what came out was dark and thin, like dirty water mixed with charcoal. It smelled of that same terrible scent, ammonia and something sweet, like flowers rotting in a vase. The men who study the blood looked at him through glass walls. They shook their heads. They said there were things in his veins that they had no name for, tiny, invisible beasts that were eating him alive. His body, usually so good at fighting off the cold or the fever, had simply given up. It was as if his defenses did not recognize the enemy. He was withering. I watched his face sink in, his cheekbones pressing against the skin, his eyes falling deep into their sockets. He looked like a man who had been starved for months. Yet it had only been 3 days since he touched the creature. In his delirium, Marco did not call out for his mother or his girl. He spoke of the eyes. He grabbed the sheets with hands that were turning gray and whispered about the deep, red pools. He said they were calling to him. He said he could feel the creature's pain, that it was alone in the dark, and that it wanted to go home. He was not raving in terror. He was speaking with the quiet, broken voice of a man sharing a secret. He said the oil on his skin was not poison, but tears. It was a sadness so potent it was killing him. Death came for him swiftly. It was a mercy in the end. His lungs stopped working, his heart simply tired of beating against the foreign thing in his blood. When he passed, the room went cold. The silence was heavy, but they did not treat him like a soldier who had fallen in the line of duty. They did not dress him in his uniform and drape a flag over him. They treated his body like a weapon. They wrapped him in plastic, layer after layer, taping it shut so that no air could escape. They put him in a sealed box, a coffin made of metal that was welded shut. They were afraid that, even in death, Marco carried the touch of the stars, a touch that could turn our world to dust. The sickness did not stay locked behind the steel doors of the hospital. It seeped out into the soil, into the air, drifting on the wind like pollen from a poisonous flower. The local zoo, a place usually full of the laughter of children and the calls of wild things, turned into a graveyard. I spoke to the keeper, an old man who loved those beasts more than he loved his own kin. He told me that the trouble started the same night the trucks came rumbling back from the woods. He said the animals woke up. It began with the monkeys. Usually they sleep deep in the night, huddled together for warmth. But that night, they began to scream. It was not the chatter of play or the warning call for a snake. It was a frantic, chaotic shrieking that tore at the throat. They were shaking the bars of their cages, staring out into the dark line of trees that borders the park. They were throwing themselves against the wire, desperate to escape, their eyes wide and white in the moonlight. They were screaming at something that the keeper could not see, something that moved silently through the high branches. The zoo director, a man of science who did not believe in ghosts, filed a report that no one wanted to read. He wrote of a shadow he saw near the deer enclosure. It was not a man, he said. It was too thin, and it moved with a strange, liquid grace, hopping from the ground to the top of a fence in one impossible motion. He shone his light, but the beam caught nothing but swaying leaves. Yet the feeling of being watched was so strong, it made his stomach turn over. He felt like prey. The next morning, they found the stag. He was a magnificent animal with antlers like a crown of bone, the king of his small domain. He was dead. There was no blood on the grass. There were no bite marks on his throat, no bullet holes in his flank. He lay on his side, his legs stiff and straight. His eyes rolled back so far only the whites showed. He had died of terror. His heart had simply exploded in his chest, unable to bear the proximity of the thing that had passed by in the night. After that, a silence fell over the cages. It was heavier than the silence of the farm. The surviving animals, the lions, the birds, the wolves, retreated into the furthest corners of their dens. They pressed their faces into the walls. When the keepers brought them meat and fresh water, they did not move. They refused to eat. It was as if they knew the world had been tainted, as if the food itself had turned to ash in their mouths. They starved themselves, shivering in the heat, waiting for the end. The zoo became a place of ghosts, where the only sound was the wind rattling the empty cages. The end of the story did not come with a bang. It did not come with an explosion or a declaration of war. It came with the arrival of the men in the dark suits. They were not from our town, and they were not from our capital. They came from further away, from the cold lands to the north. They did not arrive in trucks covered in dust. They came in black cars that shone like polished shoes. They walked through our streets with a confidence that made the local police look at their feet. They did not carry rifles. They carried briefcases, and they carried a silence that was heavier than any weapon. They went to the houses of those who had seen. They knocked on the doors of the farm, of the hospital workers, of the three sisters. They did not shout. They spoke softly with voices that sounded like dry leaves scraping together. They told us that our eyes had deceived us. They told us that the fear we felt was a mistake of the mind. They said there was no silver ship, no smoke, no creature with red eyes. They told us we had seen a homeless man, a poor, deformed soul covered in mud and sickness. They told us we had seen a couple of dwarfs expecting a child. They piled these lies upon us like dirt on a coffin, expecting us to stay buried. The three sisters suffered the most. The town, which had been terrified, now turned cruel. Fear often turns into mockery when the danger is past. The people laughed at them. They called them crazy. They said the girls had invented the devil to get attention. I saw them walking in the market, their heads bowed, their eyes fixed on the ground. The light had gone out of them. They had looked into the face of the unknown, and for their honesty, they were destroyed. The men in the suits had done their work well. They had turned the truth into a joke. The military denied everything. The general stood on the television, his chest full of medals, and looked into the camera without blinking. He said there were no movements. He said there were no trucks. But we knew. We could still see the deep ruts in the red clay where the heavy tires had spun. We could still smell the faint, lingering scent of ammonia in the hollow where the thing had been captured. The physical world remembered, even if the men with the pens tried to erase it. The smell eventually faded. The rains came and washed the sulfur from the walls and the grass. The animals in the zoo began to eat again, though they were never as loud or as joyful as they had been before. The hospital wing was reopened, the walls painted white to cover the memory of the black blood. But the town of Varginha did not go back to what it was. We are different now. We do not look up at the night sky with wonder. We look up with suspicion. We learn to speak in whispers. When we sit on our porches and the power goes out, or when a dog barks at nothing in the dark, we look at each other. We know what is out there. We know that we are not the masters of this earth. We are just living in the space between the stars, waiting for the smoke to rise again. The veil was drawn shut, yes, but we have seen what lies behind it. And once you see the eyes of the void, you can never close your own again.